Professor Avraham, we don't hear you. Please open your microphone. Thank you.
Welcome and Bruchim Habayim to everyone who's listening and watching. Tonight and tomorrow, this afternoon and tomorrow, we are having a conference of up to something like 30 lectures commemorating the 30th yahrzeit of our father, Rabbi Professor Eliezer Berkovits. At the moment, we're going to do we're having 3 lectures in Hebrew at the Van Leer Center and 3 English language lectures on this Zoom. Tomorrow, there'll be 14 more lectures in English and in Hebrew at the Shalem Center in Yerushalayim. Many of the 9 or 10 areas of great interest in which our father worked, in halakha, in Judaism in general, in history, in faith after the Holocaust, as he's well known for. Many of these areas will be spoken about, touched on, and described during these lectures tonight and tomorrow. On our program, on our Zoom program, we'll hear from 3 eminent rabbis, 2 from the United States, 1 from Australia. Each will have 40 or so minutes, and then we will be followed with 15 to 20 minutes of questions or comments, and hopefully answers. And then there will be a 15-minute break in between each of these 3 lectures. So let me introduce the first speaker, Rabbi Benjamin Elton, who is the rabbi of the Great Synagogue in Sydney, Australia, known to be a great Talmid Chacham and a Jewish historian. Rabbi Elton was born in Manchester, England, and holds a master's degree in history from Queen's College, Cambridge, and a doctorate in Jewish history at Birkbeck University of London. He is a musmach of what they call YCT, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, in Riverdale, New York. And he has been recognized for his Talmudic study. He's also written on the religious character of Anglo Jewry and on the history of Australian Jewry. His paper deals with a subject which is often an antidote or antonym to Rabbi Berkowitz's view of Jewish religion. He wrote that Judaism is not an anti-mystical religion, but it is anti-mystical because it is a religion. Both he and the following lecturer, Rabbi Reuven Moll, will speak on the subject of mysticism from various views and various angles. I'm happy to present Rabbi Elton's lecture, Anti-Mysticism in a Neo-Mystical Age. Rabbi Elton, please.
Thank you very much. And greetings from Sydney. It's a great honor to take part in this conference. As I explained to the organizers as we were preparing for these sessions, Rabbi Berkovits is, I think, the greatest religious influence in my own Judaism. And so to celebrate him on his 30th Yortzeit is very special for me. I'm not comparing myself in any sense, although I am his descendant as it happens. But I think it was said by the Vilna Gaon that if you'd appreciated who Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto was, he would have walked barefoot to Italy to pay homage to him. And if Rabbi Berkowitz hadn't passed away when I was 12, I hope I would have gone to see him and to thank him for his impact on me. It's also a pleasure and significant that I'm speaking from Sydney, because of course Sir Rabbi Berkowitz spent a part of his career in Sydney in the 1940s. My predecessor, Rabbi Porush, Rabbi Dr. Israel Porush, was in Berlin at the same time as Rabbi Berkowitz, and then they were rabbis of the two most significant Orthodox synagogues in Sydney at the same time. And they were colleagues on the Sydney Beth Din for the time that Rabbi Berkowitz was here in Australia. So it's appropriate to pay a tribute also from the Sydney Jewish community. And in fact, there are still relatives of Rabbi Berkowitz who live here, who came to live here when Rabbi Berkowitz was here. And although he left Australia, they stayed. And my discussion in this conference, as Professor Berkowitz described, with a subtitle also, a religion as a human divine fellowship. We're living, I believe, in a neo-mystical age. And that might be considered to be a surprising description, considering the strength of atheism and secularism. And it's true that there are very strong atheist and secularist trends, both within the Jewish community and more widely. The new atheism of people like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and so on. They are a very powerful influence. And many people within the Jewish community would describe themselves as secular or cultural Jews. However, alongside that, amongst all the denominations, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Progressive more broadly, there is a real growth in mysticism and neo-mysticism. In 2014, I think it was, the Orthodox Forum in New York had a special conference I attended on neo-Chassidut, neo-mysticism. If one goes to YU these days, Yeshiva University, RIETS, which was, and to some extent still is, of course, a bastion of the Lithuanian school of Jewish study. One has now mashpia in the form of Rabbi Weinberger, the Rabbi of Eish Kodesh, who is a Rebbe for all intents and purposes, and now plays a very important part in the religious pastoral care of the students at Yeshiva University. Even within the non-Orthodox streams, the renewal movements, these are very influenced by Rabbi Shachter Shalomi, who brought in many ideas of Chabad and other mystical branches of Judaism. So wherever one looks, really, one has a powerful impact of Chassidut, of mysticism, and of course from the Chassidim themselves, that the default brand of Judaism nowadays, one might almost say, is Chabad. One goes anywhere in the world, and especially if it's an obscure part of the world with limited Jewish infrastructure, people find Chabad, and Chabad almost represents standard Judaism for many people. So we have we're living in a neo-Chassidic, a neo-mystical age within the Jewish world, and this is perhaps a reaction, as Chassidut was originally a reaction in the 18th century, to what might be called an austere, maybe even hyper-legal rabbinic culture that has really pervaded Orthodoxy, become a feature of Orthodoxy in recent years, where there was a sense of a lack of warmth, a lack of human feeling in certain approaches, and people were yearning, were thirsting for an alternative to that, and it left them cold because it was cold. The Judaism that they were taught, that they experienced, that they heard from the rabbinate, and so they turned towards more mystical expressions because they do contain much more warmth and energy than what they were used to. From my point of view, as somebody who is not attracted by a mystical approach, and of course there are many definitions of a mystical approach, but I think I want to, for these purposes, we should take Rabbi Berkowitz's definition. There is an alternative, both to mysticism on the one hand, and to the austere legalistic Judaism on the other. Rabbi Berkowitz crafted an approach to Judaism which was extremely warm and warming without going down the mystical route. And in fact, as we'll see, very explicitly and firmly rejecting the mystical route. And let me just quote again the line that Professor Berkowitz introduced me with, because it's so bold and so striking, and really goes much further than perhaps is necessary for his purposes. But clearly, Rabbi Berkowitz wanted to make a point. Judaism is not a non-mystical religion. Judaism is essentially non-mystical because it is a religion. So whereas many people might associate mysticism with religion and religion with mysticism, Rabbi Berkowitz is saying essentially they are mutually exclusive. One can either be religious or one can be mystical. And as we'll see later on in this presentation, he goes on to make quite a weighty charge against mysticism and why it really cannot possibly be consistent with Judaism. So we have this very powerful statement that Judaism is essentially non-mystical because it is a religion. And what I want to do really in this presentation is unpack that statement and explore what Rabbi Berkowitz means. And the text really, which is most important in this regard, is his 1959 major theological statement, God, Man, and History. And there are many important aspects of this book, not least is the date, because it is one of the first major theological texts to come out of the newly enthused, newly enlivened orthodoxy and modern orthodoxy of the post-war period. The journal Tradition, to which Rabbi Berkowitz was a regular contributor, was founded in 1958. Rav Soloveitchik's works don't really start to appear until the 1960s, his philosophical works. So in 1959, Rabbi Berkowitz is one of the very first who is enunciating an approach to orthodoxy, to traditional Judaism, which he feels will be compelling and which reflects a sense amongst some Orthodox theologians that whereas it was seen that Reform or Conservative Judaism, particularly in America, that its triumph was unavoidable, actually there is something worth still fighting for the preservation and for the flourishing of orthodoxy and modern orthodoxy. So it's historically, in its time, it appears, I think, also particularly important. And in that volume, Rabbi Berkowitz starts with the insight or the claim that the rational project to reconstruct Judaism as a philosophical, metaphysical system has essentially failed. And I think that claim is made for both biographical and for theological, philosophical reasons. The biographical reason is, I suggest, that Rabbi Berkowitz was a student at the Hildesheimer Seminary and then a teacher at the seminary, a rabbi in Berlin. This was a community which was immersed, even in its Orthodox branch, was immersed in a real commitment to the Western philosophical tradition, coming from the Greeks, Maimonides, Mendelssohn, Kant, Neo-Kantianism, a real belief in the value of that system as it was applied and as it sought to explain Judaism. And German Jewry had been vastly disappointed by the Western tradition because it had not prevented the Holocaust. So somebody who'd fled from Berlin had to seek refuge in Britain, in Australia, finally in America. The idea that this project, this Western project, was still of value when it had almost been in collusion with the crime of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, one can see why it will be rejected, and foreign non-Jewish influences and systems being used to describe Judaism would be rejected. There's also reasons in their own theological and philosophical terms why Rabbi Berkowitz wanted to reject these systems. And I think they're twofold. The first is that when we look at the aspects of the Jewish philosophical approach in the tradition of Maimonides and his followers, there's a great emphasis on God as this absolute, transcendent, infinite being. When Maimonides tries to define God, he even goes as far as the negative attributes, that there's nothing we can say about God, only things we say are not true of God, which Rabbi Berkowitz in any ways thinks is not a philosophical move that works. But in any case, Maimonides' great point is that God is absolute and infinite and transcendent. But the trouble with that is that such a God doesn't seem to can't play much role in religion, because religion is a human activity, and therefore there has to be a meeting between God and humanity. And if God is entirely absolute and transcendent and therefore inaccessible, what room is there for religion? Excuse me. So the God of the philosophers, as Berkowitz describes that concept, isn't much use in religious terms, and yet that is what the Jewish rationalist philosophical tradition has given us. The second problem is that if as a rationalist Jewish theologians would have us believe, Judaism is entirely rational, entirely reasonable, and one can reconstruct it, just as you could reconstruct the whole of physics from first principles. You could reconstruct the whole of Judaism from first principles, and it's an entirely rational system. Then why do you need revelation? Why does God need to communicate with humanity if we could work it all out for ourselves? Now, the answer of some people, for example, Moses Mendelssohn, was that the answer is law, that one can deduce beliefs or ideas about God, truths about God, philosophically, but you can't deduce law. There's no way you can deduce, you shouldn't wear a mixture of wool and linen from first philosophical or theological principles. As we'll see, Rabbi Berkowitz is not content with that. He doesn't believe the point of religion is just to give you a series of do's and don'ts. There's something much more fundamental going on. So Rabbi Berkowitz's first point is that the mistakes of the past, or at least some traditions within Jewish philosophy and theology, was that it was mainly preoccupied with the existence of God and the qualities of God, the definition of God. Whereas in fact, religion, and Judaism therefore, is interested in the relationship between God and humanity, what Rabbi Berkowitz calls the encounter. And he points out that the Bible is nowhere interested in abstract proofs for the existence of God. It does not dwell at all or bother itself with trying to prove that God exists. But what the Tanakh is a record of the encounter between God and humanity and God and the Jewish people, God and the Israelites and God and the Jewish people. That is that's what the Bible is interested in. And as he says, we must learn about Judaism from Judaism. We're not going to take some external system like Aristotelianism or Plato, or even the way that they were refracted through Islamic or Christian thought, and try and apply that to Judaism. We're going to learn about Judaism through its own texts. And we're going to take what the Tanakh says about God and his relationship with humanity as indicative of what Judaism holds about that relationship. In this, by the way, his model is not Maimonides at all, but Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who he takes to be the most Jewish of the medieval philosophers, and really the model to be followed. So as I say, Rabbi Berkovitz is primarily interested in the encounter between God and humanity. And he writes about this very powerfully. He says, and this is the first indication in my presentation of the sort of warmth that I'm talking about, you find in Rabbi Berkovitz's writings. He writes, affection and tenderness are the very essence of the encounter. The 13 dispositions, that is to say, the 13 attributes of mercy, Hashem, Hashem, Korachim V'Chanun, no attempt is made to describe God in his absoluteness. All the dispositions are related to man. God is long-suffering, he is compassionate, he's merciful, he's forgiving. These are all descriptions of how God relates to humanity, not about God in his essence, in his absoluteness. We have seen that the absolute, this God of the philosophers, this transcendent being, as such is of no concern to religion, but only the absolute in its relatedness to man. The attributes of God, the attributes of the God of religion are of necessity relational attributes, how this absolute, in some sense, manages to relate to human beings. And there's a wonderful moment of candor and honesty about this very difficult question of how God, the absolute, which Rabbi Berkovitz doesn't dispute, he believes in an infinite God, but how that God, the God of the philosophers, and the God we know, the God who is in relationship with us, how these two concepts, which seem to be in contradiction, how they can coexist. And his answer, which is very refreshing, is we don't know. In fact, we don't know how God can be both absolute and transcendent, but also in relationship with humanity. He writes, the contradiction between the unrelated absolute, i.e., the absolute God who has can have no relationship with humanity, and the God of the relational attributes, the one we know and interact with and have interacted with historically. We don't know how the contradiction, the contradiction cannot undo, this contradiction which exists, cannot undo either the fact of the encounter or the validity of the logical inference from it. Notwithstanding the contradiction, man has experienced God's care for man. In other words, we know philosophically that God is infinite and absolute and transcendent, but we also know, because we have a record in the Tanakh, that he has demonstrated his care for humanity. So the encounter took place, it was recorded. We know what that implies, and we know we've experienced God's care for us. And by the way, I think it's very interesting, if you look at his pronouns, when he talks about the absolute, he uses the word it, because nothing can be said, even though even gendering the God of the relational attributes falls short. Nevertheless, it's more possible than in the God of the absolute God. The absolute God can only be called it. At least the Tanakh describes God in relationship as he, and therefore Rabbi Berkovitz does the same thing. So we have a vision, an encounter, an idea of an encounter, that God created an encounter with humanity, and that creates fellowship. Fellowship for Rabbi Berkovitz is the essence of religion. That's what it's all about. That God is both Supreme Lord and yet a friend. That's a quotation, quote, Supreme Lord and yet a friend. Now we know from the Tanakh, from, for example, the encounter with Moses, who's told that nobody can see God and live, and also from statements in the prophets, for example, that God is a consuming fire. Of course, the theme taken up by the Talmud, when it discusses how one can emulate God, imitatio Dei. We know, as he says here, quote, the Almighty is indeed a consuming fire. So humanity cannot withstand, as we'll see, either physically or morally, an encounter with God. The Almighty is indeed a consuming fire, but not, says Rabbi Berkovitz, because he's angry with a sinful world, but because the potency of his being cannot be sustained by anything created. We couldn't physically cope with an encounter with God in his absoluteness. Without the encounter, there can be no religion. If God didn't encounter humanity, then religion wouldn't exist, because it's about a human divine interaction. But the encounter itself, man cannot endure. We can't cope with actually meeting God in his absoluteness. God can meet man only by sustaining him against the impact of God's own presence. Man is raised up again and granted strength to retain his individuality and to be himself. In other words, God gives us the ability, either by restraining himself, withholding himself in some sense, availing himself, and by strengthening us to have some sort of encounter with him. Perhaps he's thinking of the Midrash that when God spoke at Sinai, the first 2 commandments, everyone's soul left their body, but God put it back again. God both withdraws himself, but also gives us strength because he wants us to be in relationship with him. And that's not only a physical problem, we'd all die if we encountered God in his fullness, but also a moral necessity. We couldn't survive as independent moral agents if we were faced with a full experience of God. But God wants us to be fully autonomous moral agents, because only an autonomous person can be in fellowship with another. You can't be in fellowship if you are under the kosh of the other person's overwhelming impact. He writes, the hiding God is therefore not only a physical necessity, but a moral one. In order that he should preserve the personality of man, he is allowed into fellowship with God. And this is because, quote, only because faith is a commitment made in freedom is it a commitment at all. Only on account of it is it a continuation of the fellowship initiated by God in the encounter. God wants to be in fellowship with us. Therefore, we have to be preserved physically and also preserved morally and as autonomous beings, because you can't be in fellowship if you are enthralled to the other. You must meet as 2 separate beings. And therefore, for Rabbi Berkovitz, the whole point of religion, because it's the whole point of revelation, which is the essence of religion, is fellowship, which is initiated in the encounter. This is not, therefore, the purpose of revelation to give us law. It's the purpose of revelation to create the encounter, which is the first step in this fellowship that God wants with humanity. Now, why is this why is this anti-mystical? So Rabbi Berkovitz sets out his understanding of mysticism. He writes, the mystic's goal is the surrender of personal existence. His desire to merge himself into the one, to pour himself into God, to be sucked into the all. The mystic finds fulfillment in the extinction of his identity through being consumed by the absolute. For him, individuality is a burden and a shame. Only the one or the all is real, and every form of separateness from it is an unworthy shadow existence. In other words, dveikus, this cleaving to God to such an extent that one is even absorbed into or dissolved into God. That's Rabbi Berkovitz's view of mysticism. In the encounter, on the other hand, the originally threatened separateness is affirmed. God keeps us going as separate individuals. In fact, it is granted the highest dignity by being sustained by God. The encounter may occur because the individual personality is safeguarded. God keeps us as individuals so that we can be fellows with him. Where there is encounter, there is fellowship, and fellowship is the very opposite to the mystical surrender of man's identity in an act of communion. The mystical communion is the end of all relationship, and therefore the end of all religion. So for Rabbi Berkovitz, you can either be a mystic or you can be religious. You can't be both. And then, in a very strong turn indeed, he says this: there is a natural affinity between mysticism and pantheism, which is a huge departure from any sort of traditional Judaism. All mysticism tends towards pantheism. Once the mystical union is completed, there is nothing left but the absolute in which all is contained. The appropriate worldview of the mystic is pantheism. Now, he identifies this pantheism with Spinoza, of course, the greatest Jewish heretic that ever lived, and says, in what's really a moral charge against him, that with love for God, which we should have which a mystic would have, is the same love which God with which God loves himself. And because we are now one with God and we love God like he loves himself, we have, quote, the monstrous example of self-love. So there is no love of the other. There is no reaching out in love to anything external to oneself. There is only self-love, which is morally monstrous. And so this takes Rabbi Berkovitz to derive a principle of Judaism from its non-mysticism, that it's not only non-mystical, it's also essentially anti-pantheistic. So obviously we would all recognize Judaism as a indeed anti-pantheistic religion. And that for him goes hand in hand with it being non-mystical, anti-mystical. So a very serious charge and a very weighty, powerful separation between mysticism as he understands it and Judaism. Now, of course, Jewish mystics would deny they're pantheists. They might say they're panentheists. They don't believe that everything is God, but they might think that God is in everything. But nevertheless, it seems that Rabbi Berkovitz does not have sympathy with the view that they are panentheists. He would say, even if they are panentheists in their intention, the logical conclusion, their position would be that they're pantheists. This is very strong stuff. Now, this view of non-mystical, anti-mystical Judaism, essentially, necessarily anti-mystical, changes the way that he understands or molds the way that Rabbi Berkovitz understands mitzvot. Although his major work on halakha, Not in Heaven, is a different volume, in God, Man and History, he nevertheless talks about what is essentially going on with mitzvot. And the law, mitzvot, halakha, is an extension of the encounter. It's what keeps the encounter going beyond that moment of encounter. He says, the essence of the law is the same as that of the encounter itself. It's an expression of God's continued concern with man. The God commands man is proof that he considers man. The law represents the highest affirmation of man, as well as his crowning dignity. By giving man the law, his maker declares, I do care how he lives and what he does with his life. The law itself is a manifestation of God's love. So again, there's great warmth you find in Rabbi Berkovitz's theology. By obeying the command of God, the human organism itself becomes related to God. By doing the will of God, it is enabled to enter into a relationship with the divine. So the mitzvah relationship goes two ways. By giving mitzvot, it's not because God wants to tell us what to do, it's because he is expressing his care like we do to our children. We want to guide in particular paths because of our care and love for them and wanting their best interests. By following the mitzvot, we enter a relationship with God. Our bodies, our physical selves, which should in no way be able to have a relationship with God, who is wholly non-physical. But when we hear shofar, shake lulav, bind tefillin, our bodies, these physical, material objects, are suddenly in relationship with an entirely non-physical God. And that's a remarkable thing. When we pray, even when we pray without thinking, our bodies are doing the will of God, and that's a remarkable thing. And this is in, I think, direct contrast to a mystical, theurgic view that mitzvot are a mechanical device for changing metaphysical reality. There's a mechanical process. We do a mitzvah, something changes mechanically in the metaphysical, spiritual element of existence. A Hasidic rabbi in Sydney described mitzvot as pipes that allow blessings to descend from heaven to earth. And if you don't do a mitzvah properly, there's a blockage in the pipe. So why do you put a mezuzah? It's a pipe for blessings to descend. If it's a not kosher mezuzah, there's a block in the pipe. You have to unblock the pipe. I think Rabbi Berkovitz has no sympathy for that point of view. It's about doing God expressing care for us by wanting us to place reminders of his unity and our duty towards him on our doorposts, and the physical action of putting it up and seeing it and maybe even kissing it, but not a pipe through which blessings descend or can be blocked from ascending to earth. Now, there are other functions of halacha of him too, ethical living, but the essence is this act of fellowship. God shows his care, we respond. This is the essence of non-mystical fellowship. And to me, speaking personally, this is much more exciting and inspiring than a mystical approach, than a theurgic approach, which has never spoken to me. And perhaps it's time that this approach found a wider audience, which is perhaps struggling to find a middle way between the Scylla and Charybdis of strict legalism or austere legalism and mysticism. So I want to conclude before we go to comments and questions with Rabbi Berkovitz's definition of faith, which is the ongoing element of the encounter, the fellowship between God and humanity. He says this: the essence of faith is a sensitivity of the entire personality to the presence, even when the realness of the presence is not as directly evident as in the acute form of the encounter. God cannot be totally overwhelmingly present. That would be unable to, we couldn't sustain ourselves physically or morally. We couldn't be independent agents if God's presence was absolutely apparent in its full strength. And so God withdraws himself. However, faith is perceiving, understanding, being sensitive to the continued presence of God in order to maintain fellowship, which is the continuation of the encounter, which is the essence of revelation and therefore the essence of religion. But that all that requires two parties, two independent autonomous parties, and therefore is inconsistent with mysticism, which is about a fusing and a dissolving of all those who wish to cleave to God with God himself. Thank you very much. We have a question. Is Rabbi Berkovitz's understanding of mysticism, for example, becoming one with God, referring strictly to practical mysticism as opposed to the study of theoretical mysticism in an effort to understand God? So I think he is referring to even theoretical mysticism, that if one understands that is that's the ultimate reality, or the ultimate religious aim to which one should be directed. That's a theological commitment, a belief, which Rabbi Berkovitz believes is at odds with authentic Jewish thought, with accurate Jewish thought. So even theoretical mysticism, I'm sure I would suggest he rejects because it's wrong-headed in the basic underpinnings of Judaism. Question: how does Rabbi Berkovitz view Rav Kook? That's beyond my ken, I'm afraid. I can't help with that. Although you may have heard I heard recently, Rabbi Soloveitchik said you can't treat Rav Kook as a as a systematic philosopher. He expresses his feelings, but it's not systematic philosophy that can be really analyzed. But that's Rav Soloveitchik, not Rai Berkowitz.
I think we find that my father respected Rav Kook to a great extent. In fact, my brother Dov, who is our shutaf in preparing this conference, studied with Rav Kook for several years when he was a young man. And Rav Kook being a great Zionist, he was very close, my father was very close to his ideas, if not to his philosophies.
Well, that's good to hear. There can be a fellowship even across the mystical, non-mystical divides.
Always. We don't see any more questions coming in, unless some turn up in the next minute or two. I really want to thank you, Rabbi Elton, for this wonderful opening lecture for our conference. It was you dealt in depth as well as in breadth in the subject where our father stood relative not only to mysticism, but also to his God and his understanding of Judaism as a whole, and its dependence on the encounter, as he called it, and as you renamed it, he called it again. Here we have another question now. You want to read that?
Yes, if I can bring it up. Rai Korn, it's an honor to have your question. How can we distinguish between true divine encounter and illusion, between true revelation and falsehood? Well, I think for all practical purposes, he would say that the Tanakh is a record of authentic encounter. I don't think he would really suggest there's been much encounter since, especially, I mean, we know that the age of prophecy is over. So the encounter was with the patriarchs, Moses and the prophets. And although people can have religious experiences, Judaism is now set. Its demands and its beliefs are now set by the Bible, and the Bible tells you what's an authentic encounter, and anything outside that certainly doesn't have force. Even if a person might have an individual encounter, it wouldn't change anything about the way Judaism works.
How does all this relate to what is called theodicy?
Well, yes, it does very much relate to theodicy, because a human being, God sustains a human being as an independent moral agent. He wants to be in fellowship with independent moral agents because that's the only true form of fellowship. One can't be compelled to be in fellowship, and therefore we must remain morally independent agents. That being the case, we are called upon to do the right thing, but we can also do the wrong thing, and bad things happen. This omits natural disasters for the most part, but bad things happen when the independent moral agents that God allows us to be, when we choose to do the wrong thing and not the right thing. The only way to avoid bad things happening because of human action is to make us into robots, and that would be a breach of our dignity and moral autonomy, and that's what God wants to sustain, because he wants to be in fellowship with us.
If you look at the next question, it's related to this, I think.
If God can be both transcendent and immanent, why can't we surrender to the absolute and maintain our individuality? Well, one can't have a relationship with the absolute. So you can't surrender to it I propose, because you can't have any relationship with it at all. It's so transcendent and removed. Even surrender isn't possible. One can only have a relationship with the relational God, and if you're a mystic, you want to merge into that. But if you're non-mystic, you want to have a relationship with that, and that's the distinction. Is the encounter the center of Rabbi Berkowitz's theology? If so, how does an immaterial essence from the other species communicate with us as sensory bound? So that's where Rabbi Berkowitz says we don't know. That we know that God is infinite and absolute, and we also know he communicates with us. How those two things interact, we don't know. We just know they're both true. So he's honest about the question and says, it does. Those two parts both do exist. How they exist, well, that we don't know.
There's another one.
He can see them.
How do Rabbi Berkowitz understand the communication on Har Sinai?
This is all Roy.
I'm not sure I can answer how he understood it technically, but somehow God communicated with Moses. There was some form of communication. I'm not sure he's particularly concerned with how that communication actually took place, but there was an authentic communication from God to Moses of what he wanted Moses to write down. Because he's not so wedded, or the opposite, he doesn't believe he has to explain how the absolute can communicate. He has to explain how the relational God can communicate, and that's much easier. The relational God, which is, as Reuven Marl, I think, will really talk about further, is already a restrained, reduced sort of element of God that perhaps can communicate in ways which we can recognize. It's only the absolute God you have to really work out how on earth the absolute God can communicate. But the relational God, considering that this aspect of God exists, probably has an easier time communicating in a way which we can understand.
Okay, we have room for one more question, if there is one.
Questions were from Roy. Those questions were from Roy.
Some. So I think we have to leave them laughing, or so they tell us, but certainly smiling. It's been a wonderful lecture, and I want to thank you on behalf of not only the family, but also of all those who are tuned in and listened to this wonderful thing, and we'll keep in touch.
Thank you so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference. Thank you for the honor of taking part.
It was our pleasure and our honor.
Kol tov.
Welcome to our second lecture this afternoon. It will be given by a very good friend of mine, Dr. Reuven Marl, who in his daytime experiences is a well-known general and cosmetic doctor in Rappaport, in Manhattan.
Dentist.
Cosmetic dentist in Manhattan, but in his spare time he's a Talmud Chacham. To wit, he has spent 10 years delving through the complete library of our father's writings, the books of Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz. Among other things, he has brought out two very fine books. One, a Haggadah of Pesach, and the other one, a copy of Megillat Esther. Megillat Esther is called Faith Fulfilled because that is a sequel to Faith and Freedom, which is the Seder night. And each one of these books, which are published by Urim Press, and by the way, are on sale tomorrow and tonight at the two venues of our conference. They are accompanied by selections from the writings of our father, Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, which enlighten and expand the various interesting corners and sentences in the Megillah and in this Seder, as Dr. Moll has chosen them. To do this, he had to make himself familiar with 17 books of the 19 that our father wrote at one time. Rabbi Dr. Moll was received smicha from Rabbi Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg in Manhattan, though he lives in New Jersey. He writes in the lecture which he will give now. It is actually a sort of a sequel to the previous lecture by Rabbi Elton, because he writes about Tzimtzum. He will speak about Tzimtzum, which is a concept by Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, and it comes especially into play when speaking about Briat Olam, about the creation, divine self-control, freedom of choice, and he will present the ideas of our father Eliezer Berkovitz on Tzimtzum when it's related to these things: divine self-control, freedom of choice, the state of Israel, and halakha, all these things. So then only remains for me to ask Ruvain to join us and to begin his lecture.
Yes. Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, great.
Welcome.
Okay, so hi, everybody. Shalom. It's really a pleasure to speak in honor of Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz. I'm working with two screens here because one of them was hard to use with this computer, so I'm just going back and forth. It's really a pleasure to speak on behalf of Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz. I have been engrossed in the writings of Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz for the last 10 years, and it's been just a rewarding experience. I appreciate Rabbi Dov Berkowitz and Rabbi Avram Berkowitz for asking me to speak. I have built a strong relationship with them over the last 10 years, and I'm very thankful for this. They have been so helpful and encouraging. It has been one of the highlights of my life to be absorbed in Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz's writings and to publish 2 books compiling his ideas and thoughts through a medium of his life cycle events. One is a Haggadah, and another is Megillat Esther. Rabbi Berkovitz did not write a commentary on the Haggadah, nor on Megillat Esther. I found excerpts throughout his writings and applied them as commentary to the text. His writings and philosophy have really majorly influenced the way that I think and act. I also admire his moral courage to speak out in what he believed was the ethical way. It was also a treat to speak between two scholars, Rabbi Elton and Rabbi Elef. Rabbi Elton was the editor of the journal where I first published an article on the thought of Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, and Rabbi Elef wrote a review of my Haggadah when it was published. Okay, so let's discuss the topic of Tzimtzum, which I think is a critical idea to understanding Rabbi Berkovitz's thoughts. His idea of divine self-control, which is another word for Tzimtzum. I think, as I hope to convey, it has an effect on every aspect of his philosophy. Let's go to the second slide. Thank you for doing that, Michal. So let's go to the second slide. Great, Tzimtzum. Okay, thank you. Tzimtzum, the definition of Tzimtzum is divine withdrawal, divine contraction. God self-contracted himself in order to create an imperfect world. Somehow, God restricted his own transcendence in order to create a world that is not infinite. We will discuss briefly Rabbi Luria's concept of Tzimtzum, and then delve into Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz's idea of divine self-limitation and how it differs from Rabbi Luria. There is divine self-restraint, and that God created man and the world that is imperfect and finite. And as a result, God is present in the finite world. The questions that arise are, how can a God who is perfect create a world that is imperfect? How can finitude be created from infinitude? And how can man do anything if God is all-powerful? If there is any room for man to perform and create, do we all have free will if God encompasses all? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Rabbi Isaac Luria, okay, some things. Jenny? I don't have my notes.
Okay, you need to go to,
Let's get out.
don't stop touching it. This is you. Don't touch it.
Rabbi Isaac Luria, okay. Rabbi Isaac Luria was called the Ari HaKodesh, the Holy Ari, or the Lion, or the Arizal. He was the leading rabbi and a Jewish mystic in the community of Tzfat in northern Israel. He is considered the father of contemporary Kabbalah. His teaching are referred to as Lurianic Kabbalah, while his direct literary contribution to the Kabbalistic school of Tzfat was extremely small. He wrote very little. The works of his disciples, especially Rabbi Vital, compiled his oral teachings into the writings. Every custom of Rabbi Luria was scrutinized, and many were accepted, even against previous practice. Even in halacha, his opinion is important and quoted. Rabbi Luria developed the idea of Tzimtzum. Go to the next slide, if you can. Thank you. Okay, here we have a diagram of the 10 Sfirot. The Kabbalists discuss the Sfirot, which are the 10 parts of the divine, the Godhead. The Keter, which you see on the top, is also called the Ein Sof. It's the highest Sphira, which is the highest level of divine essence. Then there are two levels of understanding, Bina and Chachma, which come underneath in the chart. There is an additional level of Dat, which is on the left diagram. These stand for Chabad. Chachma, Dat, and Bina, Chabad. Chachma, Bina, and Dat. Then the lower down the ladder are two competing characteristics of Chesed and Gvura, kindness, pity, and strength. There are many writings comparing and contrasting these. Then we get to the lower sphere, Tiferet, Hod, Netzach, and Yesod. And finally, the lowest on the ladder, which is the Malchut of the Shekhinah, which we call the divine essence, or the divine presence, which is the closest to our world and somehow present in our world. The Kabbalah discusses how much we do and we know about God's essence. The question is, do we really know the lowest parts? Do we know the upper parts? Do we know the essence of God? and all these are the Sfirot. Does the Shekhinah alone have the Tzimtzum, or do more of the Sfirot have the Tzimtzum? Luriana Kabbalah says that the Shekhinah broke off from the rest of the Sfirot in order to create the world. That's what Shekhinah de Galuta means, that the Shekhinah is in exile. Somehow the Shekhinah broke off from the rest of the Sfirot. God then somehow is not complete, according to Luriana Kabbalah. His Keter, or Ein Sof, which is on the top, and some of the other Sfirot, are not together with his Shekhinah. God's Shekhinah was mitzamtzem and created the world and is present in the world. When the Jews went through many catastrophes, through the many exiles, we were consoled by saying that just as we were in exile, God's Shekhinah was also in exile. His Shekhinah was in exile with us. Okay, let's go to the next slide of negative tzimtzum. Thank you. Negative tzimtzum. I call Rabbi Luria's concept negative tzimtzum because basically what happened was that there was a defect in God, according to Rabbi Luria, that there was some type of blemish. The Shekhinah somehow separated from the rest of the Sfirot. Somehow it caused a flaw and an imperfection in God. There was a shvira, a breaking. Rabbi Luria maintains that it became our responsibility to mend and fix God and cause a tikkun, a correction in God, to reunite the Shekhinah with the rest of God's essence. The way we do this is by performing mitzvot. This is how many Hasidim follow. When the Hasidim say the Hineni prayer before a mitzvah, that's a preparatory prayer, a preparatory wish before they do a mitzvah. They wish to bring back the Shekhinah with the Ein Sof, and by performing their act, it brings them closer. I call this negative tzimtzum as an effect of the tzimtzum. It caused a defect in God, and it also seems that it was not intentional. If we look at the slide, this is a quote from Gershom Shalim on the Kabbalah and its symbolism. He goes through a three-step process explaining Luriana Kabbalah, that first there was the tzimtzum, the self-limitation of God. Afterwards, there was the shvira, or the breaking of the vessels. Somehow within the svirot, there was some type of breaking, and therefore God is not, would say, perfect as it were, and there's some type of defect. And then there's a tikkun, there's a harmonious correction and mending of the flaws, which came into the world through the shvira, through this breaking. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to get to Rabbi Berkowitz's writing. I like to read his writing because this way we get a sense of who he was and how he wrote. This first source is from God, Man, and History, page 64 to 65. Let's read the first paragraph together. God's involvement with the realm of a finite reality is imaginable only as an act of divine self-limitation, as it were. Notwithstanding his transcendence, bends down to the world of finitude. He humbles himself, as it were, in order to relate himself. He reduces himself so that he may enter into the narrow straits of relationship with a finite existence. But the fundamental act of divine involvement is creation itself. We shall therefore have to look at it as a basic deed of divine self-limitation. God created the world. He creates the world of a finite being by curbing the full manifestation of his essence and power. In order to create, he must restrain his infinite potency to such a degree that nothing may issue from the work of his hands, which surpasses the boundaries of a finite universe. Creation is only conceivable as an act of divine self-abnegation. God is involved in the destiny of a finite being as a result of an act of self-denial. It's amazing that he uses so many different terms that are reminiscent of the Tzimtzum. It says God bends down to the world of finitude. He humbles himself. He reduces himself. He curbs his full manifestation. He restrains his infinite potency. All of these are reminiscent of Tzimtzum phraseology. And in order for God to be involved and be concerned for man, there must be self-limitation. We do not know his full essence, God's full essence, because God hides that from us. His involvement, though, which we'll see, because he says in the next paragraph that with his hiding, let's read just a few sentences more, this is perhaps the fuller meaning of the concept of the hiding God. God not only veils his presence so that it may be endured by man, he denies his essence so that the world of finitude may come to be, and he himself remains involved in it. An act of self-limitation is the premise of creation, as well as God's involvement in the destinies of the world of man. His involvement, though, as we shall see, is his constant hiding. His hiding is his act of involvement. Rabbi Berkowitz views the involvement of God through God's constant self-limitation, which is for the benefit of man. In order for God to be involved, he has to keep self-hiding. It's a continual doing of God that he does this every single day. He renews his creation every day, and he self-denies himself every day in order for God to be involved in the world, because he curves his involvement. He curves his essence in order to be involved in the world. He writes in the second paragraph, an act of self-limitation is the premise of creation. When we think now about Bereshit and creation, this gives us another take on how Hashem created the world. We should think of God self-limiting himself and his essence. In order to create a world and thereby remain in it by continually hiding himself. Without this continuous hiding and self-limitation, creation would not be, and God would not be near. Let's go to the next slide. Are you able to go to the next slide? Thank you very much. One meets the Talmudic version of his thought. We're reading on the top. This is from a footnote on page 64-65 in God, Man, and History. This footnote is such a crucial footnote in Rabbi Berkowitz's writings. It's in the back. It's in the footnote that discusses something that's going on in the major part of the book. But this footnote, it's the only time where Rabbi Berkowitz contrasts his concept of divine self-control to Rabbi Luria's idea of tzimtzum. The main idea here is that Rabbi Luria's idea of tzimtzum is preparatory to creation, while Rabbi Berkowitz's idea, he says that it's the very essence of creation. Creation must be finite. It can't be infinite. God must hide his full essence, and he can't create in his full essence. God must self-limit his divine essence in order to create. There must be a separation between man and God in order for there to be a relationship. We are not part of God, and God is not in nature or man. What he says in the first paragraph here, let's read together. One meets the Talmudic version of this thought, which is divine self-limitation, in the interpretation of the meaning of the divine name Shaddai. Shaddai is one of the names of God, which means that God said to the world enough. Shaddai, from the word enough. According to Rav Reish Lakish, the name is a contraction of an entire phrase which maintains that in the act of creation, he called to the world enough. Without that command, the world, as the result of the mightiness of the creative act, and we're going to see through a couple of more slides where he loves the word, Rabbi Berkowitz loves the word mighty, in that the divine is mighty because of his self-limitation, of the created act might have become limitless. And he quotes from the Talmud Bavli and Chagiga, but since the world did not create itself, God must have given the command to limit the work of creation to himself. We see in this interpretation the Talmudic version of creation as an act of divine self-limitation. And here, this is a key sentence. We do not feel competent to judge to what extent our concept of divine self-limitation is identical with Luria's focal concept of tzimtzum. Rabbi Berkowitz does feel that there is some analogy between it. He does contrast between Rabbi Luria and the next paragraph, which we spoke about. But at the same time, with the last sentence on this in this excerpt, he says, with Luria as well as in our direct discussion, divine self-limitation establishes the reality of the particular and individual and makes the encounter and thus religion possible. There needs to be a separation between God and man. Religion can't be possible if they're merged. If God and man are together and merged into one, that is not a religion according to Rabbi Berkowitz. Let's go on to the next slide. Thank you. Kabbalist writers, here it is an excerpt from Rabbi Berkowitz, specifically mentions Rabbi Luria. What he says is Kabbalistic writers make use of such ideas in order to render the historic facts on which Judaism is based, God, Israel, and Torah more meaningful and more challenging for the individual Jew. The Ari HaKodesh, which is Rabbi Luria, is a good example of how, as long as these constants were not lost sight of, even Gnostic ideas could be included within the scope of Kabbalistic Jewish philosophy. This is from an article from Tradition, What is Jewish Philosophy? Basically, that there has to be a separation between God, Torah, and Israel. There needs to be a distinction between them. If there's no separation, then we are then merged into God, and God is merged into us. That can't be. There has to be a separation, and it has to allow us, it has to allow humans, it has to allow us to have individuality in order to have a relationship with God. We know that Rabbi Berkovitz relies heavily on the concept of tzimtzum, which Rabbi Luria developed, and that's why he makes an exception almost with the Ari HaKodesh with Rabbi Luria, because generally he feels that Kabbalah or Kabbalistic writers or mystic writers do away with this separation between God and man. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Thank you. Holiness. Here's another excerpt from another book, Man and God, describing God's self-limitation. And the reason I'm bringing a lot of these slides is because I really want to show how in many of his books, this was such a crucial and key concept that Rabbi Berkovitz couldn't get around. He really tried to explain how this divine self-limitation explained almost aspects of Judaism. God is infinite. God, who is infinite, would not be able to create the world. So God self-limits himself that God can be near and accessible. And here in this excerpt, he basically says that we are holy and God is holy. And God is holy because of this separation, because of this withdrawal. And he compares us to God, that somehow because God separates himself from his essence and dwells amongst his people and becomes kind of finite, the infinite is unrelated to the finite by its essential nature. He says here with the bold part, thus God too, as it were, has to separate himself from the natural indifference. Let's read again. Thus God too, as it were, has to separate himself from his absoluteness in order to turn with care and consideration towards his creation. He has to withdraw from the natural indifference of an infinitude in order to be the father of the orphans and the judge of the widows in his holy habitation. He has to curb his holy otherness so that he may come near for the sake of his holiness. It is this awe-inspiring greatness of his holiness that he who is infinitely removed draws near and makes himself accessible. So at the same time that he withdraws and he curbs his manifestation of his essence, that's what allows him to become near and to care for the orphan, to care for us, and to care for something that's outside of his infinity. Let's go to the next slide. Might of God, humility. There are going to be 3 slides now that show how Rabbi Berkovitz viewed God and his might. According to Rabbi Berkovitz, the might of God is portrayed through his self-denial, through his tzimtzum. Let's read the slide. Bolder still than the prophets were the teachers of the Talmud, who possessed sufficient spiritual courage to make the daring statement, where you find the mightiness of the Holy One, blessed be he, there you find also his humility. The humility of God is a frightening term, yet God's concern for lowly man cannot be explained in any other way. What he's basically saying is that when we think of God's humility, we may think of it as a negative term. We may think of it as a criticism. But Rabbi Berkovitz switches turns it on its head and basically says, no, it's a compliment. God's humility, we're going to see God's silence, God's self-withdrawal, everything about it is positive. He does this on purpose. His self-control, everything that he does, it's for the sake and the concern of man. Individuality is maintained and preserved by God. I call Rabbi Berkovitz's concept of divine self-limitation a positive tzimtzum, in contrast to Rabbi Luria's, which was a negative tzimtzum. God is mighty because of his expression of retreat and humility. God's continuous humility allows for God's concern to allow humans to have individuality and free choice. Let's go to the next slide, which is the might of God, silence. Here's another example of divine might. All of these sources are showing to what extent Rabbi Berkowitz wanted to prove that the silence of God is showing God's concern. It's a positive attribute. After the Holocaust and other catastrophes, we view God's silence as a question of how God could let this happen. Why didn't God intervene? Rabbi Berkowitz answers that this is an attribute of God. Silence is an attribute, that God created the world in this way. He is continually silent and self-limiting. The rabbis changed the word in Micha Mocha Be'elim Hashem to Micha Mocha Be'ilmim Hashem. Who, and we're going to read it in here, let's read, there was the study house of Rabbi Yishmael in the middle, where they quoted another verse of the Bible, who is like thee, O Eternal? This is a compliment, who's like thee among the mighty? This is from Shmot, Parak 15:18. But replaced the Hebrew Elim by Ilmim in order to make it read, who is like thee, God, among the silent ones? This is no longer a question as the question of Jeremiah, Chakuf, and Job, that question God, how can you not intervene? It is formulated as a problem. It is an exclamation, God, you are silent. You are not seen in history. So we see that this does not mean that God does not care. Quite the opposite. God cares and is near. That's why God is silent. He flipped the idea of silence to be a positive attribute. Let's go to the next slide. Might of God, where he limits his power. This is another example where you see, this is from Faith After the Holocaust, another example. The other ones were from different books, where the rabbis and the Talmud saw the mightiness. Again, we see this word might all over the place of the Almighty, in that he controls his inclination to judge and to punish, and behaves in history as if he were powerless. Such is the mightiness of God. God is mighty and he's powerless. And he lets his own way, extending to him long suffering. God is mighty in the renunciation of his might in order to bear with man, yet he is present in history. And then we see on the bottom, God renders himself powerless, as it were, through his forbearance and long suffering, yet he guides, which means God allows history to happen. He does not intervene. He's silent. He's humble. He allows history to take place. And these are all positive and mighty characteristics of God in order to allow us to be human, in order for a relationship to take place. And this shows that God is near and God is concerned for man. And he says here that the survival of Israel is Rabbi Berkowitz's proof that God is present. God is present in history. We may not feel his presence. That's something that he says because of his silence, but he is present. And we know that he's present because of his self-control and because of his self-limitation. Let's go to the next slide, separateness. I know it's a lot going. I'm trying to cover a lot of ground. Okay, so we have the next slide, separateness. Rabbi Elton, in the previous shir, he discussed that Eliezer Berkowitz was anti-mystical. And he's anti-mystical because, and it flows from his idea of tzimtzum, that there must be a separation between man and God. What the mystics wanted to do was to merge God into man, or man wanted to merge into God, and thereby there would be no separation. Rabbi Berkowitz writes here that Judaism is essentially non-mystical because it is a religion. The mystical communion is the end of all relationship, and therefore also the end of all religion. In the last paragraph, he writes that the mystic endeavors to overcome all separateness. The pantheist, which is Spinoza's philosophy, which is very close to the mystics, denies it from the very beginning. Judaism, on the other hand, through its concept of the encounter, affirms the reality as well as the worth of separate and individual existence. Judaism is not only non-mystical, it is also essentially anti-pantheistic. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is an important slide. This is a slide that explains hiding of the faiths, or Hester Panim. We think a lot of the times that Hester Panim is a punishment. And here he writes in Faith After the Holocaust that that's one way to view Hester Panim, or hiding of the face. But another way to explain Hester Panim is, which he says in number 2, he uses the words in divine indifference towards the plight of man, but it really means that divine silence. We may glean a hint, let's read it right afterwards, we may glean a hint of the theological significance of such an apparent divine indifference from a passage from Yeshayahu. And Yeshayahu says, verily, thou art a God that hidest thyself, which means you are a God that hides. He exclaims it, it's something that he says. But at the same time, O God of Israel, you are the Savior. And it's beautiful, what Rabbi Berkowitz writes. He says, in this passage, God's self-hiding is not a reaction to human behavior when hiding of the face represents God's turning away from man as a punishment. But for Yeshayahu, God's self-hiding is an attribute of divine nature. Such is God. He is God who hides himself. Man may seek him and he will not be found. Man may call to him and he may not answer. God's hiding his face in this case is not a response to man, but a quality of being assumed by God as an own initiative. God did this on purpose. It's a quality of God that the God who hides is the God who saves. And his saving is basically saving man and saving the relationship and saving everything that has to do with creation. It's a continuous act. And therefore he says, in some mysterious way, the God who hides himself is also the God who saves. All of these are examples to show the might of God, that God's divine self-limitation is a complement, it's a positive attribute. We think again that silence of God is something negative, but again, Rabbi Berkowitz goes out of his way over and over again to show that there has to be something positive to his divine self-limitation. Let's go to the next slide. Partnership. Now that we established that God willed this on purpose to self-limit, going back to the name of God as Shaddai, the God who said to the world enough, it is now our responsibility to create. The phrase Letaken Olam b'malchut Shaddai, which is translated, which we do say in the Aleinu prayer, is translated as to correct the world in the kingdom of Shaddai, the God who said enough. And it has very different meanings to many different people. When the mystics, through the Kabbalists, read this, Letaken Olam, right? It means tikkun, to correct, to perfect the universe through Shaddai's sovereignty in the Aleinu prayer. They interpreted the statement as saying that only we and not God are the redeemers of the world. We and only we must redeem and unite Shaddai by bringing together the Shekhinah and the Ein Sof. But Rabbi Berkowitz thinks differently. According to Rabbi Berkowitz, however, humans do not fix or restore God in any way. God purposely left room that people would have to redeem the world by finishing God's creation. Also, like Rabbi Berkowitz, Rabbi Soloveitchik in many of his writings also discusses Tzimtzum. Also in his book Halachic Man, he also writes of man's partnership with God, and he also sees it not as a blemish in God. In fact, it's a positive attribute, and that's why we call it positive Tzimtzum. And in this slide, we see in the middle, we say that man, according to his own strength, is not either God or man. Man, according to his own strength, continues the work of creation and become urged on by God's call, a humble associate of the Creator. God, who withdrew himself from creation, we now have the responsibility to continue God's creation as a partner in God's creation. Let's go to the next slide. This is the Torah Tamima, Reb Baruch Halevi Epstein. Let's read it in Hebrew. Uvichlal tzarich be'ur, ma shevachu lahakadosh baruch hu, b'ma she'amar la'olama dai. What praise is there to a God who says to the world, die? By the way, this commentary, the Torah Tamima, was Reb Baruch Halevi Epstein. It's a commentary on a pasuk in Bereshit, which we have underneath, where Hashem comes to Abraham and says that I am God who is El Shaddai, the God who said enough, which we translated before. Rabbi Berkowitz said was the God who said to the world enough. And Rabbi Epstein has a question. What praise is there in a God who says to the world enough? ומה כוונת העניין. ואפשר לומר על פי מה שכתוב המפרשים, התכלית כוונת הקדוש ברוך הוא בבריאת העולם הייתה לאושר וזכות האדם להשתדל, להתעסק ולהתקדר במעשה העולם. God's intention in creating the world was for the merit of man to try to get involved and excel in the doings of the world, and through this will gain the completion of the soul. And if God would not have said to the world enough, and there he says, והנה אם לא היה הקדוש ברוך הוא אומר לעולמו די, הייתה הבריאה נגמרת. The creation would have been complete. ומסתכלת בכל השלמות הדרושה עד ששוב לא היה מקום לאדם במה להתגבר בו. There would be no room for man to do anything. Everything would be completed. What novelty would man have in this world? ומה לחדש בעולם? We need to create. We need to bring things new into the world. If God completed everything, then we would have nothing to do in this world. אבל מכיוון שאמר די, but because God said to the world enough, הניח בזה מקום לאדם לישראל מעשה הבריאה. Like Rabbi Berkovitz, I think this is a great comparison. He agrees that we are a partner in creation. God withdrew, he said enough to the world, and we need to be a partner in God's creation and finish God's creation. Let's go to the next slide. Two more examples where Rabbi Berkovitz, one in God, Man, and History, and another place in Jewish Women in Time and Torah, where Rabbi Berkovitz again says that we need to finish God's creation. He who knows of the encounter and the revelation of the law is sure of God's concern and care. Wide with history as man's creation of mankind. It's initiated. He also knows that even those long stretches of human history during which God seems to be silent, he is in fact silent in his love. This is what we said. It's a positive attribute. God loves us, he cares for us, and he's silent because of that. In the boldness of faith, man may often recognize the hints of the working of the hiding God, not to mention those rare moments when man is overwhelmed by more convincing signs of divine concern. And here he says, the rabbis of the Talmud were right to view man as a partner of God in the works of creation. Here's a great line. Who would say where the work of God comes to an end and where the human contribution begins? Man may be as nothing before God, yet God nonetheless desires man partnership. And here's another source from Jewish Women in Time and Torah. Judaism commits the Jew to be the ever-enduring vital partnership with God. The result is a Torah Chaim, a living Torah. And it can only be living, it can only be a Torah Chaim if we are involved and if we create and if we partner with God, because God withdrew himself in some way, but at the same time, he is creating every day by his presence and by his silence. We are therefore partnering with God and continuing his creation. Let's go to the next slide of prayer. God has remained with the world and renews daily the works of creation. The renewal of God's creation is daily. And therefore, we have to believe that God creates on a daily basis because we pray to God. Prayer is only meaningful only on the basis of a theistic worldview. So it's in the middle of this paragraph. This is from his book, Prayer, another book. One may pray only because one is able to believe that even after the act of creation, God has remained with the world, that indeed he renews daily the works of creation. The renewing the daily of the works of creation is the creation process of self, the creation process itself, that God self-limits himself every day, that he's mighty every day because of his silence. He allows religion to take place because of our individuality. We pray to a God who's concerned with us and is near to us, at the same time silent. God shows his concern through his silence, and the silence is his love, and we are partners with God in this creation. Let's go to the next slide of freedom. Throughout his philosophy, Rabbi Berkovitz shows in so many different instances that the self-limitation creates everything about Judaism. And here he shows that in order God is hiding, the encounter has to take place in order for us to have individuality. In the middle, we see the same language over and over again. God hides himself. Man may confront the divine presence only because God curbs, as it were, his transcendence. God denies himself in order to affirm man. These are in all different books that he writes about this. By an act of divine self-denial, man is made free to deny him. And in order to be encountered, man must possess his own self, which means we have to have individuality. We also have to have freedom. And this is an important sentence at the end. The act of divine self-denial is the precondition of the fundamental religious experience. Everything about religion and Judaism has to do with God giving us the freedom to act and to have free will. In order for us to be able to relate to God, we also have to be able to have that freedom. Let's go to the next paragraph. The next one says miracles. So the question becomes now, if God is silent, how could there be miracles? Does God intervene? Rabbi Berkovitz has an explanation here that yes, there can be miracles, but at the same time, they can't be all the time. He calls them a divine corrective, only when it's really, really necessary in order to somehow correct something that's going on in the world. What he says in the last paragraph here is, when does this happen? It's a more bolded here. When does this happen? When do miracles happen? And when does it not happen? And he admits only one who was admitted to the divine counsel at the time of creation and to whom the divine purpose is known would know the answer. Of course, Rabbi Berkovitz tries to explain it, but we really don't understand God's essence and his behavior. However, two aspects of the miracle may be derived from the interpretation. First of all, the occurrence of the miracle must be extremely rare, or at least not readily recognizable. For frequent or manifest divine intervention would subjugate man. It would basically conquer us. We wouldn't be able to act if everything was a miracle and God acted on our behalf for everything and intervened for everything. And it would take away our individual freedom and destroy that very freedom without which he cannot be human. Secondly, we are able to see the deeper significance of the rabbinical dictum that one must not rely on miracles. Ein somchin al hanes. For man has been called to fulfill his humanity in responsible action. Basically, the miracle is a corrective act. And it only in very rare occasions does God perform miracles. The majority of the time within nature and within the world, there's the silence because of the positive attribute of divine self-limitation. In the next slide, history of Israel, what we see is he does make an exception to the rule as well, where he talks about miracles in the first line. He says all God's miracles occur outside of history. When God acts with manifest power, history is at a standstill. And the only exception to the rule is the historic reality of Israel. There is in the other bold where it says there is no other witness that God is present in history, but the history of the Jewish people. God's own destiny in history is joined to the history of Israel. And he says at the end, only a small people whose very existence is forever assailed by the forces of power history and yet survives and has an impact on world history completely out of proportion to its numbers and its material power proves the validity of another dimension of reality and terrifies and testifies to God's powerless guidance to the affairs of men. God's own destiny in history is linked to the history of Israel. Only by means of Israel may his, of necessity, unconvincing presence in history be surmised. So he does concede there are times, and God guides, but with silence, and in a way that can't subjugate us and can't really take away our freedom. Let's go to the next slide. Halacha. When I read this is I think that this is crucial also to the understanding of Rabbi Berkowitz. Let's read these excerpts, because I think it's really a continuous flow of his philosophy. We've seen his concepts when it comes to freedom, when it comes to prayer, when it comes to holiness. But here it's also when it comes to halacha. And here it's in his book, Not in Heaven. There's a story in the Gemara, Baba Metzia, Daf 59b. It's a striking Gemara that says that there was an argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. And basically, a bat kol, a voice from heaven comes down and says that Rabbi Eliezer is correct. And then Rabbi Yoshua says, Lo bashamayim, the Torah is not in heaven. What we say is, we listen to pragmatic truth, but not to objective truth. And here, let's read this paragraph. Once the Torah was revealed to the children of Israel, its realization on earth became their responsibility, to be shouldered by human ability and insight. The divine truth had to be poured into human vessels. It had to be humanized. Having left its heavenly abode, that sounds just like Tzimtzum to me, that there's divine self-withdrawal. The Torah had to be accommodated in the modest cottages of human uncertainty and inadequacy. Thus, this in essence is the task of halacha. And then he says again on page 79, the bat kol, which is the voice from heaven, of course was right, but its pronouncement was true. It was absolute truth. That is why it could not be accepted on earth. The affairs of the people on earth cannot be guided by a permanent hotline to the heavens. So we see that there's self-control, there's divine self-control in every aspect of his philosophy. We see it with holiness, we see it with prayer, we see it with freedom, and I think also we see it with halacha. Intellectual tolerance goes hand in hand with the realization of lo bashamayim, that the Torah is no longer in heaven. Rabbi Berkowitz fought hard what he thought was right within halacha. There are many examples where he used the Sfara as an example, his own education and his own, what he thought was the right way to do, what he thought was really the ethical and the moral code, and what he thought was the right way. And that's what really I admire about him, and what many people admire. A lot of slides, the next slides are a different subject, so I think that we can stop here. But I hope this gave an overview of Rabbi Berkowitz's essential view of divine self-control in his writings and how important this concept is to his philosophy. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Ruben.
Thank
It's
you.
wonderful to listen to you, as always.
Questions?
Thank you very much. It's always a
Do
pleasure.
we have
Thank
any
you.
questions? Question.
Ask, not answer.
You covered practically every corner of Dad's interest and work.
Thank you. I tried to put together all the excerpts that had to do with divine self-limitation,
Yes.
therefore to cover his ground, but it's a lot, and it's a very it's a hard topic and a very critical topic of his.
Very typical of the way you do things.
Thank you very much.
I'm particularly impressed, as always, with the conclusion that the halakha is not in heaven, that it's for us to do. And it brings me back always to the idea that we have in Bereshit, Kodesh Baruch Hu put Adam HaRishon into Gan Eden, Le'avda u'Leshomra, to work the land and to look after it. And as you say, and to repair it or to improve it.
Yes, that's one of the major points of his philosophy, is that we continue his creation.
Apparently, it was very clear to everyone.
Thank you.
We have almost 50 people listening. Well, I'll take the opportunity and thank you again and remind everyone, here's something. Roy Pinchot is asking something. Roy Pinchot has been a supporter of this conference all along, and he's a great, always been a Talmud and a supporter of our father's work. Can you see what he's saying here? He says it's an excellent exposition of Rabbi Berkowitz's views as seen from the springboard of the Tzimtzum. It seems that Rabbi Berkowitz's concerns were with the nature of man and morals, and not with the operation of Nevuah. Well, that is true, isn't it? What do you say to that?
Yes, I think that there are many places where in his book, Not in Heaven, where he brings, for example, La Korata Torah. There are places where we're even able to uproot the rules of the Torah in order to preserve what's going on. And when he says the nature of man and morals, it's because of ethics. One of the major philosophies of Rabbi Berkowitz was his moral standing of the aguna, of women, a lot of other examples as well. And he felt through halacha that these were ethics that he had to convey.
Yes. Someone who is nameless says that the whole gist of the Torah is God directing history. Joseph, Jacob, the prophets, the Avot, all consider themselves to be agents of God in history. How does this fit with the theory?
Ask him if you can see the chat.
Do you see the chat? Reuven.
I see the bottom part. I don't see the top.
Oh. Well, the question is that God is directing history through all the main personalities of Torah, of Tanakh.
Yeah, God is definitely conveying through man. I think that that's one of his main philosophies. What we've shown is that we need to perfect and we need to continue God's creation. When we act today and we perform good deeds and we perform mitzvot and we do that, we are in essence following God's creation and what God wanted. He withdrew himself in order for us to finish and to continue his creation.
Somebody asks, he quotes,
Yes, there is actually a quote of his, which I'll find right now. It's from his book in prayer, which I hooked to in the Haggadah to Hu Heitiv, Hu Meitiv, Hu Yetiv Lanu. He says, Rabbi Berkowitz writes, this is from prayer pages 49 to 50. As to Thanksgiving prayer itself, we do not thank for a specific blessing, but for God's miracles that are with us every day and for his benefits that we receive at all times. That's V'al Nisecha. Every evening, morning, and noon, we thank him for he is the good one whose mercy never ceases, because he is the merciful one whose loving kindness never ends. How do we know of the miracles and benefits of God, which are always with us? The Jewish answer is that one who knows it because one lives, because one's dependence on God is such that he could not live for one moment without the goodness and mercy of God. We thank him because we realize in the needfulness of nature that we could not exist for a single breath without the merciful one whose loving kindness never ceases. That's from prayer, page 49 to 50. That's straight from Modim Anachnu Lach that we say every day from the miracles, that God's miracles are with us every day. But again, God's miracles that we see are on a daily basis. We see them as maybe as silence, as a divine self-limitation.
Yes.
And one of the miracles is also that I think that that we are continuing in God's creation is a miracle also, that God withdrew in order for us to create, to be a partner with him.
I believe it's the Rambam who says, if you want to see the hand of God, look at nature, because that works by the rules. The last question which we have time for, somebody writes, if the point of creation is the encounter between the divine and man, and such an encounter is only possible through God, through Tzimtzum, how, according to Rav Berkovich, is man supposed to mimic God as part of that encounter, as part of man's calling to complete the creation individually, socially, and globally?
So I think that one of the slides we talked about holiness, that we supposed to mimic God, that when God gives us the command of Kadoshim Tihiyu, to be holy, that just as God separates himself and withdraws himself from his essence in order to somehow come to finitude and relate to the world, we also, it's an interesting analogy with Rabbi Berkovitz we also have to separate ourselves in a way with that which prevents us from the nearness to God. Holiness, to Rabbi Berkovitz, is acting in accordance with ethics, acting in accordance with also separating ourselves with things that would not be in the way that God would have commanded us to do. So I think that we need to mimic God in withdrawal. That there are a lot of ways that Rabbi Berkovitz talks about that just as God withdraws, we need to withdraw. It's the concept of a meteo dei, that we need to copy God. God withdraws in silence, then sometimes we need to withdraw in silence. Sometimes God is humble. We also need to be humble. These are all attributes that we should copy and be like God in that way.
With that, on that beautiful note, that beautiful thought, I'll say thank you again. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it, and it's an honor to listen to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all your encouragement and help through the years. It's really amazing.
Well, we'll keep on.
Thank you.
Rabbi Elef, Shalom Aleichem.
Aleichem Shalom, Professor Berkovitz. I thought if I'm zooming into Israel, I didn't need to be so formal.
Well, because you were there, I put on a necktie.
So we both missed one another. I usually have a suit and tie.
And never the twain shall meet.
Very good to be here.
Nevertheless, let me introduce you. First of all, thank you very much for coming on in this conference we're running this afternoon and evening and all through tomorrow. And this afternoon, the Zoom is 3 English lectures and 3 lectures in English, it's better to say so, given by 3, I would say, distinguished rabbis. Let me just say a few words about Rabbi Zev Elef, and then I'll let you start. Rabbi Elef was born in Philadelphia and raised in Baltimore. And he is a musmach of Yeshiva University. While he studied at the university, he also studied at Columbia University Teachers College, where he received a master's degree and later on a PhD in American Jewish history at Brandeis. He's been described as a man of great breadth You look fairly slim, but a great breadth in thought, I suppose, has been in addition to 9 edited books, also has published over 50 academic and scholarly articles. And his paper this evening
Meet you in Chicago.
I should add that Rabbi Elef was for a number of years at HTC in Chicago, and is now at the Grades College in Philadelphia. He is going to speak about our father's thoughts, Rabbi Berkowitz's thoughts on the United States and American Jews. And of course, he will also come across the relationship to Eretz Yisrael in what is called the Galut Eretz Yisrael theology. The topic of his lecture is rather, I would say, exciting, because it's not very clear to me what he means, but he will tell us what Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz's American anthropology is.
Galut anthropology.
His Galut anthropology.
All right. Thank you so much, President Berkowitz, and to
Take it
my
away.
mother and to my mother apparently for writing those remarks for you.
Well, I skipped most of what she wrote.
Very good.
I didn't want to
It's-
embarrass either her or you.
It's delightful to be here. Thank you so much. And I see that I'm being joined by board members. I'm currently the president of Gratz College in Philadelphia, but my true to be a part of this this conference is really a tribute. But I suppose my only worthiness is that, in fact, my office as chief academic officer of Hebrew Theological College for some 7 years was in fact Dr. Berkowitz's office in the yeshiva building. So if I am able to draw, I'm not a very mystical person, and neither was Professor Berkowitz for that matter, but if I could draw from his inspiration, his wisdom to share something this evening, this morning, depending on where you are in Zoom land, it'll be a credit to that. And also I should hasten to add is that I'm also glad, therefore, to represent my colleagues, my former colleagues, but they're still my good friends, the staff and leadership of Hebrew Theological College, colloquially known as the Skokie Yeshiva, which will figure in to my remarks. And it's a good thing because I'm able to show some archival items here this evening. I did, as Professor Berkowitz, and I should thank the entire family for inviting me here. It's really just an honor, really just an absolute, what can I say? This is Professor Berkowitz, Eliezer Berkowitz, is one of the most outstanding thinkers and champions of Judaism, however one dissects it: Orthodox Judaism, historical Judaism, philosophical, thoughtful Judaism, Galut Judaism, Eretz Yisrael Judaism, however one offers a prefix to that. Professor Berkowitz is one of the critical, you cannot speak about the experiences of intellectual thought without mentioning Dr. Berkowitz. He was in conversation and dialogue from Heschel to Kaplan to Rabbi Soloveitchik to Fackenheim to so many scholars, to Yitz Greenberg, quite obviously, loomed large. I take a bit of risk by accusing a European-trained philosopher of anthropology. But there is something to it, and I promise I don't mean to offend. Here from the Jewish exponent is the notice to the Jews of Boston in the mid-1950s that a treasure that they had just received in Dr. Berkowitz, who was an activist and a shul rabbi for that matter. He had previously held pulpits in Australia and in England, and of course, before the tragedies of the Holocaust, was ensconced in Germany as a young rabbi of a large congregation. the sad notice to the Jews of Boston that Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, about him, the Theological College of Chicago, that is HTC, Hebrew Theological College, according to an announcement by the college, he will teach Jewish philosophy and certain aspects of rabbinics. He's being called to take an opportunity. Dr. Berkovitz was trained in the Hildesheimer Yeshiva. He was very close, of course, to the Sridei Eish, or Jacob Weinberg, and had designs on contributing to America in the same way of teaching and educating a generation of rabbis who were duly trained both in rabbinics and in Chachmat Yisrael, of Jewish wisdom. He will also be associated with a program in the new schools of the college. Rabbi Berkovitz came to Boston in August 1950 from Sydney, Australia. He was the rabbi of Congregation of Yeshurun until 1956. If you skip down to the second penultimate paragraph of what I've blown up, Hebrew Theological College is the only Orthodox rabbinical seminary in the Midwest. Of course, there was Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, still is. That's for form. It also maintains a Teachers Institute. In addition to rabbinical teachers' diplomas, the college is also authorized to grant degrees of Master and Doctor of Hebrew Literature. The college is currently constructing a $5 million campus. It was on the west side of Chicago until then, in the Lawndale neighborhood, and was in the process. It had secured about a quarter of that to this point. $5 million campus in Skokie, which was the next hub, the northern hub right outside of Chicago proper. The university, when completed, will have, in addition to the above named units, a four-year liberal arts college, the Rose Cone College for Women, that itself is a different lecture, a graduate school of education, a research school of Talmudic law, and a preparatory academy. So in other words, Dr. Berkovitz was coming to Chicago at a propitious moment. He was slated to be the leading academic figure, replacing a longtime scholar, Professor Meir Waxman, great scholar of Jewish literature and history. Dr. Berkovitz was going to come in and have a major impact on what was one of only a handful of Orthodox rabbinical seminaries in the United States. Ever the gentleman, he writes in that same newspaper, an edition or so later, to the editor, having arrived safely and well in Chicago, my thoughts and those of my family turned to the many friends who rendered our last days in Boston a happy experience by the rich manifestations of their moving friendships and loyalty. To them all, our sincere thanks. My family and I regret that it was not possible for us to take leave personally of all our friends in the greater Boston community. It's a lesson in Midot, actually, this letter. We send them through the courtesy of this column, our warm greetings and good wishes for the future. As I see it, so this is, to my knowledge, the very first statement of action of Professor Berkovitz's ambition for his work that's going to take place in Chicago. My work in Chicago, with the help of God, will not be either an entirely new beginning or a mere repetition of something previously undertaken by me. I look to the intensification of a consistent theme and to a more purposeful reaching out toward the goal of my previous endeavors. Of course, being a public scholar, a writer, major Talmud Chacham, too modest to have put that in writing, of course, but where there is continuity, there the past is present and alive in every new day. Thus, we hope that our friends in Boston will remain with us as a continuing presence in this new phase of old strivings. Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, who in his address now at Hebrew Theological College. Now, from the Chicago side of things, President Oscar Fassman thought that he had a steal. Writes to Uri Miller in Baltimore, a modern-leaning rabbi there. Dear Uri, many thanks indeed for your assistance to the budget. That's a nice way of saying thank you for the donation. It is an uphill struggle to keep the budget afloat while campaigning heavily in behalf of the building programs. You see, the $5 million haven't quite yet been secured. I think I have one definite achievement. So this is a private letter in the HTC archives. I think I have one definite achievement in the educational field of the yeshiva. You have to understand that for most of us, it's yeshiva, and for Chicagoans, it's yeshiva. field of the yeshiva by having brought to the faculty Dr. Eliezer Berkovitz. He is an excellent man in the field of philosophy. He is genuinely pious, and what is very important from our point of view is the fact that he is a wonderful teacher who holds the interest of all the students in his classes. You see, this is part of the photography archive that I also made sure to scan from the HTC archives. With kindest regards from home to home, and again, with many thanks, I am cordially yours, Rabbi Oscar Z. Fassman. So they thought that they had a champion, and indeed they did. Now, for Dr. Berkovitz, what was America to him? America was a new frontier. It was part of Galut theology, Galut anthropology. And for that, time and again, here is one of his sermons delivered in England in 1942. Words which seem to apply as the Shavuot, May 1942, seem to apply very closely to the present situation of the Jewish people. Remember, of course, we're talking about 1942, where once proclaimed by the prophet Yechezkel, Ezekiel, and I will bring you out from the people and will gather you out of the countries wherein ye are scattered with a mighty hand, with a stretched out arm, and with fury poured out. And I will bring you into the wilderness of the nations. This is the operative sentence. And there will I plead with you face to face. The future of Judaism may depend on our willingness to grasp fully the implication of these words, face to face, of how does one interact with the Galut. And for Dr. Berkovitz, there was a formula. Think of Russian Jewry, of Polish Jewry, of German Jewry. They are no more, sadly. Remember, he's writing in 1942. There are only former Russian, Polish, German Jews uprooted and wandering about in the wilderness of the nation. Our whole people in this situation. Remember, he's writing from England. All of us. We like to think that American Jewry and English Jewry, right, in England, and he's stating American Jewry first, have been spared the tragedy of living in the wilderness. This is a misinterpretation of Jewish history. This would be true if the breaking up of the great historic Jewries were only a matter of migration, a matter of geography, of whither, where to go, where to find a new home. Thank God, these questions and problems do not exist for the English and American Jewries. They are protected from the Nazi onslaught, materially at least, and for the time being, they are settled. And yet they too live in the wilderness. So do not think that the wilderness is Europa. The wilderness is different. In fact, this tragic process of breaking up of historic Jewries, of the disintegration of Jewish settlements, of banishment from the homes which Jews have found in the countries of the world, and which have been in some cases, they have inhabited longer than the present occupiers, into the homelessness of a new exile, capital E exile, into the wilderness of the nations, started with the ancestors of those Jews who today constitute the bulk of the American English Jewries. The tragedy began 60, 80, and 100 years ago. The Great Migration from Russia in the 1880s to the United States. With the Great Migration of Jews from Russia, Poland, and Romania toward the West, it has culminated in our days in the breakdown of all continental Jewries. Do not think for a moment that the wilderness is all exile. No. The wilderness could be taken of two ways. Either America is a terrible wilderness, it is a midbar that one does not know how to operate, but in fact, Yechezkel gives you a formula that you have to interact, you have to understand how to operate in the midbar. And for Dr. Berkovitz, speaking, this is a publication of a delivered sermon. English Jewry and American Jewry have far to come in order to understand how to properly operate as a Galut Jewry. Let it be understood that we do not treat here only of the recent refugees that form the continent. We deal with the Jewish situation in the countries of America. What else are the Jewish communities in the United Kingdom or in the USA or South Africa, but the ghostly shadows of great Jewries? What else but the debris of the former Russian, Polish, and Lithuanian Jewries? A rebuke, stop talking about English and American Jewries. There is no such thing as yet. There are Jews in these countries. but these countries have not yet become homes to new Jewries. There's no such thing, according to Dr. Berkovitz, as an American Jewry. They are still part of the wilderness of the nations into which Jews have to be driven. You want to create their Tzvei Dinim. He would not have liked to have me necessarily to invoke Brisker Torah terminologies, but there are Tzvei Dinim. There are two different ways of looking at a wilderness. There is a wilderness that is you're able to operate in, and then there is a wilderness where you are not anchored, you are unmoored. For Dr. Berkovitz, writing about America, not yet in America, the United States was an unhinged collection of Jews who had not yet figured out how to do American Judaism. The style of living of the new Jewries, which are to be formed, must be based on the foundations of the Jewish past. And here, what is the formula? One has to connect the past to the present. It must retain the intentions of our great religious culture, and it must relate Judaism to the rest of the world in the midst of which we have to live. I want to seize on that. Writing in 1942, not yet, maybe it was greatly prescient, but Dr. Berkovitz had no designs yet of being in Chicago, certainly not Chicago, probably not Boston, and yet understood that there has to be a vision for American Judaism. It has to grab on to the past and stay focused on the future. It cannot be static one way or the other. It cannot be present only, and it cannot be past or future only. It has to negotiate the tenses. And you'll see that is the theme that comes up over and over and again. It's good to do a reception history of a philosopher, somebody very consistent in thought. In another essay in one of his earlier books on historical Judaism, a chapter called Organizing the Golah, Jewish history teaches us, this is still in the early 1950s, that at any point in our Galut existence, we possessed certain forms of inner Jewish organization that were of the greatest importance for survival. Today, the principles behind organized Jewish life in the Galut are in danger of falling into oblivion for two reasons. First, for about 150 years, now a misdirected Jewish emancipation, it's referring to German Jewry and Reform Judaism's quest towards emancipation as a solution to what Germans, even before Hitler, certainly called the Jewish question. It's an early Christian concept, has sapped all the foundations of Jewish life. Second, with the destruction of Central and Eastern European Jewries, the mainstay of historic Judaism has fallen. Most of the institutions which kept alive a flourishing Jewish organization, the Galut, are no more. Worries Dr. Berkovitz, how can the rest of Galut, if English and American Jewries are successfully to shoulder the responsibilities which the Jewish tragedy in Europe has laid upon them, they will have to learn from certain experiences of the now prostrated European Jewries. They don't have an extant version of a roadmap, a formula about how to do Galut Judaism, worries Dr. Berkovitz. They have, it was one thing to draw from the resources and the models on the continent in Europe, but English, British Jewry, American Jewry, South African Jewry, Australian Jewry needs to somehow reconstruct that from the shards of a destroyed European Jewry in his mind. And that's the only way to do it. And we see that's consistent from his sermon in 1942. Here I'm willing to read you the entire thing because I suspect that most people, maybe even the Berkovitz family, haven't seen this editorial because it appeared in the Yeshiva Women newsletter in 1959. It was a short observation by Dr. Berkovitz within months of reaching where he initially lived on Chicago's West Side. I believe he first lived on the Chicago West Side. I'll be glad to be corrected. Before I get there, one late summer afternoon. So this is why I hazard to accuse a philosopher of offering anthropology. This is my excuse. One late summer afternoon, as I was walking through a Jewish neighborhood, my attention was caught by an interesting scene. A number of people were sitting in two groups. So imagine it's the Lawndale neighborhood, the west side of Chicago, where you have bungalow style homes, not much space in between them, maybe 3-bedroom houses, on the porch of a middle class home. That's judicious middle class. One group was formed by a patriarchal figure of an old Jew. So this should be familiar. He was a man rich in years, obviously approaching the close of his earthly pilgrimage. His head was covered with the traditional yarmulke and his face adorned with a long graying beard. He was sitting in an armchair, deeply engrossed in what was undoubtedly a sefer, a book from the traditional literature of Judaism. At some little distance from the old man was sitting the other group. They were younger people, apparently of the same family, possibly children of the old Jew, or perhaps his grandchildren. They were silent also, but absorbed in the reading of this newfangled thing, relatively speaking, newspapers that were scattered around and about them in almost numberless sheets, scattered about. One old man is reading a proper tome, a traditional sefer, the others with this ephemera, this thing called a newspaper. The old man did look like a complete group all by himself. Here were two worlds on that porch, the one of Zeta and the other of Zeta's children, two worlds alike and side by side, but one could sense the gulf unabridgeable that separated the one from the other. There were a father and his children, so close to each other in space, and yet far removed from each other in communication. Skipping down, I just want to read a few more. It's worth almost reading the entire thing, but we have much to cover today. There is a silence of anger, the icy silence, and there is also a kindly and encouraging one that is a balm to the heart. Skip to the third section, the third page, the middle paragraph. The old man's silence was saying all this and much more, but his children did not hear it. They were far away. What was it about the tradition, about the prophets and the Talmud and the traditions, the minhagim? They were far away, roving restlessly over endless sheets of black print. Again, one book has ink that is spilled in tradition. The other one, these newspapers, are messy black print. They were barricades behind their own silence. And what a different silence it was. It revealed to the observer that the children had just finished their evening meal, and it was too early yet either for their favorite TV program, right? New technology, TV program. This is 1950s. So by now, most Americans home had a television, if not two, by the end of the 1950s. Favorite TV program, or for the show they were planning to see that night. What could one do at such a moment between work and entertainment? To converse, to think, perhaps to read a book? About what? The children's silence spoke of boredom and mental exhaustion. And he returns to this theme, this anthropology, this observation about the dilemma of American Jewry as an American Jewry of the Galut. Writing an important article in Judaism, founded by the American Jewish Committee in the 1940s, the American Jewish Congress, in the 1940s. Dr. Berkovitz was also very eager to find where he belonged intellectually. He published, we'll see, an article in Tradition, the magazine, the journal, that was edited by Rabbi Norman Lamb and Professor Marvin Fox starting in the late 1950s, and Dr. Berkovitz was an early contributor to them. Judaism, which was non-denominational, it was a forum, and Dr. Berkovitz contributed maybe 5, 6, or 7 articles in the first decade or so, engaging with highly trained scholars. And again, and so I think this is what is engaging for me about this is to introduce, perhaps not to all of you, but maybe to 1 or 2 of you, that when we think of Dr. Berkowitz's corpus, when we think about his literature, we think about his Holocaust theology, we think about Faith After the Holocaust, we think about his criticism, his polemics against Heschel, and his idea of the notion of prayer. We think about his criticisms of Mordechai Kaplan, Reconstructionist Judaism, a long review of it. We think about we think about obviously his views of halacha, not in heaven, which would be part of his later efforts in the 1970s. But there was to Dr. Berkowitz an interest in writing articles such as Jewish Living in America that appeared in the journal Judaism in January 1953. So here's still in Boston. Never before in the history of the Jews has assimilation been so easy. This is before Look magazine in the Vanishing American Jew in 1964, of course, and also so tempting as in America. Let me move the zoom button so I can read it. The civilizations of the old world were mostly exclusive towards minorities or newcomers. Neither did they have the moral excellence to make them. So now in the United States, Dr. Berkowitz notices something else, is that America's very open. There was something, the strategies of Galut Judaism was about being a part of an organized minority that wasn't allowed, that there were red lines for interaction with the non-Jewish culture. Neither did they have the moral excellence to make them, for their own sake, a desired form of life for minority groups. Jewish assimilation in Europe was mainly a policy of escape from the consequences of Jewish living, conversion. He's referring to, I assume. Of course, it had to face the heartbreaking irony that his endeavor to escape the assimilationist Jew had to embrace a ruling civilization that in its treatment of minorities was sufficiently inhuman to make escape desirable. Going to the section, as a result, the traditional or historic forms of Jewish living have been caught in a process of continually advancing disorganization, and the vacuum thus created has been invaded by living practices based on the one-day wisdom of newspapers. See it again, newspapers and magazines, on mass-produced thinking and streamlined feeling, on the standards of taste of the motion picture industry and the values of the TV screen. The Berkowitz family will have to tell us if there was a television in their homes in Chicago. Again in Judaism, writing in summer 1955, and here is a wonderful image. Of course, Dr. Berkowitz, I think it's his last work, writes about women and Torah, women and halacha. Here he is addressing students in Ida Crown Jewish Academy. It's actually where I went to high school. I think, pretty sure. It is futile, he writes in 1955, to frighten the American Jew with the specter of anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, this is no longer the case. You can scare Jews in the United States about anti-Semitism, that is. He knows, of course, of its existence, but rightly or wrongly, he will not be scared. He has confidence in America and considers it his duty to stand up and fight for a fuller implementation of the ideals of freedom and equality in America. And I have to take a step back here. And somebody, I think, thank goodness I have had the great fortune of reading Dr. Berkowitz's major works, both his monographs, his books, and also his essays. There is a stylistic difference in what I am reading with you today and how he writes in his more philosophical works. I was fortunate to edit a volume, the reproduction of Faith After the Holocaust that Corin produced. I'm hopeful working with Corin again on another edited volume, which some of this is contained within it. This is an interesting type of writing. And if you had, I just ask, if you didn't know, and all of us know, we're here because we know Dr. Berkowitz, we understand his intellectual footprint. This reads as eloquent as Dr. Berkowitz always was, but there is a stylistic difference when he's writing about the contemporary scene. In the present situation, its premises, when applied to the American scene, do not point to the road to Zion. So here's the other point, is that Dr. Berkowitz more and more it's introducing the role of Galut Judaism to support Zion, to support the Zionist movement. And here in 1955, as Jewish United Appeals across the country were fundraising to support the nascent state of Israel, here's Dr. Berkovitz on American Zionism. And I'll talk about Zionist education and cultural links with the Jewish state. Chicago had a, well, this is just about to go to Chicago, but Chicago is a robust Zionist center. And I'll talk about Zionist education and cultural links with the Jewish state, about Jewish pride and self-interest will not induce American Jewry to seek its redemption in Israel. Of course, that was towards the end of his life where Dr. Berkovitz did make Aliyah. It will support Israel. This is about American Jewry. It will take genuine pride in the achievements of the Jewish state, and rightly so. It will well appreciate its self-interest in the state's security and well-being. It will send visitors as well as money to Israel. It will even organize Hebrew classes, yet America will still be no galut. The paradoxical situation has arisen that in the phase of Zionism's triumph, its reason for the rejection of, the typo should be galut, have conditioned hosts of good Zionists to reject the idea of geula in Zion for themselves. You can't, here's another element of it. You cannot be a galut unless you acknowledge a geula. Yom HaAtzmaut, events, Israeli dancing and cuisine, support of Israel is very fine, but Dr. Berkovitz's criticism here, and I should say criticism in a good way, is that much of it, this is in the post-war period, many intellectuals in America were writing criticisms. And that was how you move the needle on different movements. Offers Dr. Berkovitz that if you want to be invested in the galut, you have to be thinking about the geula. And your awareness and identification in Israel has to be toward that end. It cannot be an end in and of itself of all the different items of Hebrew education, of Israel education, of tzedakah that's earmarked towards Israel. One has to think more directionally about Israel, whether it's Aliyah, this is 1955, most people are not thinking about it at that time, or something about the sustainable support of the state of Israel. Now, Dr. Berkovitz, I should be very quick to explain, was deeply invested in creating the infrastructure of Galut Judaism in Chicago. So, for example, and elsewhere, this is from the archives of the Council of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of Baltimore, for instance. And in that, and this is from 1966, November 1966, to blow up the section I want to raise to you, old business. Important rabbi here, Rabbi Israel Tabak, if you go down, Oscar Fassman will discuss that Rabbi Yosef Cairo, all of these different people who will come to speak to the Jews of Baltimore. Here is, and Dr. Eliezer Berkovitz, who will discuss what is the Jewish tradition in today's movement for civil rights. So he's deeply invested. Interesting is that I'm familiar with Rabbi Regensburg, who was the dean of the faculties for a short while at Hebrew Theological College, or Tshuva, about the civil rights movement. And I apologize. The Berkovitz family knows well that their name gets misspelled all the time. I don't know if it's this bad, but I'm not aware of Dr. Berkovitz's written articulation of civil rights. So it's as a dual purpose. I'm showing this to you, and also a good inquiry about whether or not he published those remarks ever. But he was deeply invested, not just in bringing the past into the present, that whole style of arranging and organizing Galut Judaism, of creating something which draws on a past. Again, the disadvantage is that Jewry on the continent and Europe was dismantled. But the idea of taking the past and merging it with the needs of the present is how you do it. Here in the Sabbath Voice, again, I mentioned that Chicago has had a robust Mizrahi movement, religious Zionist movement. Here is a notice from, I believe, 1969, excuse me. So after the 6 Day War, the citywide cultural program Saturday, March 15th, sponsored by the Ben Zion B'nai Reuben, Hatikva, Neely, and Skokie groups, will feature Dr. Eliezer Berkovitz on the topic of the theological significance of the state of Israel. I imagine much of that was drawn from the final chapter it's me speculating, of faith after the Holocaust. Dr. Berkovitz embodies the rare gifts. It's important to understand, to the Berkovitz family, to understand how much he was treasured. I know you know this, but to reconfirm, Dr. Berkovitz embodies the rare gift of a dynamic presentation, which can completely captivate an audience with pertinent, informative content, which richly rewards those in attendance. Chicago Jewry is fortunate to have the services of such a scholar teaching at the Hebrew Theological College, and the Mizrahi, Hapoel HaMizrahi, is fortunate and honored to have had him consent to be our guest lecturer in our citywide series, right? An unnecessary notice of it, but altogether very necessary to underscore the importance of having a public intellectual of Dr. Berkovitz's caliber in Chicago. Dr. Berkovitz at some point moves to Skokie proper. It's actually about 3 to 4 miles away from the Hebrew Theological College. But he's part of a small group that forms congregations. Actually, I believe they lay claim to being the largest Orthodox congregation in the Midwest. It's Congregation Or Torah. Used to be a member there until a year ago, so we relocated to Philadelphia. Here is one of its earliest documents in the 1970s. Just so you understand Dr. Berkovitz's activism and contribution to he didn't just talk the talk, but he walked the walk. Resolve that the president of this congregation, this is Or Torah in Skokie, Illinois, be and he is hereby authorized and directed to form a committee of 3 members of the congregation to inform that certain individuals who have not conducted himself in a manner befitting membership or attendance at this congregation, that he is no longer welcome to participate in any manner whatsoever in or with this congregation. I don't know if Dr. Berkovitz would have taken this stand at that he did at the moment, but they were a breakaway congregation from another one just down the block in Skokie, and so there was a need to create certain expectations of davening. It's a high bar to pray at Congregation Or Torah. Resolve further that said committee, when appointed as or aforesaid, be and it is hereby authorized, directed, and empowered to take any and all steps deemed necessary in their judgment to carry out these resolutions. The president then appointed a committee in accordance with the resolutions passed by the congregation, consisting of Dr. Peter Schrock, Mr. Melvin Appel, and Mr. Roy Pinchot. Dr. Berkovitz then pointed out that halachically, such an individual were to persist in attending services, the members of the congregation could and should ignore the individual, even to the point of not counting him for the purpose of a minyan. I don't know how nefarious this individual would be. This is a man who maybe some regard as somebody who is beholden to kulas, also had his chumras. Dr. Berkovitz, the gabbai and ritual chairman, then informed the meeting of the following rule, which rule hereafter would be in full force and effect, to wit, so on and so forth. So there was a need to create decorum and certain expectations at their new congregation, and they wanted to make sure that the people that they prayed with all understood those expectations. That's my point in sharing this with you. Finally, he tried to carry this out, of course, for many years, for almost 2 decades. Actually, I should say his career spanned 3 decades at the Hebrew Theological College. He writes an article in Tradition called A Contemporary Rabbinical School for Orthodox Jewry. It's his fullest articulation for his goals for the Hebrew Theological College. In the main, there are 2 kinds of yeshivot. The first one is the old world type, which has been transplanted as completely as such transplants are possible from Lithuania, Hungary, or Poland. Such are, for instance, the famous yeshiva at Lakewood, Pismench Kabbalah of Ravon Cutler, or that of Telz in Cleveland, by then being led by Mordechai Gifter, or that of Panovich at Bnei Brak in Israel, Panovich Rav, of course, of Shach later after him, and many others. Then there's also a kind of modern Orthodox version of the old yeshiva, only 2 in numbers. The one, the large and world-renowned Yeshiva University in New York, and the much smaller Hebrew Theological College in Chicago, now located in Skokie, Illinois. The curriculum of the Old World type is dedicated almost exclusively to the study of the Talmud and the codes, with negligible emphasis on the Bible as a subject to be taught, and no teaching at all in the subjects that are generally known as Chachmat Yisrael, i.e. Hebrew language or literature, Jewish history and philosophy, etc. The curriculum of the modern Orthodox yeshiva, or if he is referring to his own yeshiva, is different. There too, there is great emphasis laid on Talmud and codes, but Chachmat Yisrael is part of the curriculum, and general studies at colleges and universities are not frowned upon. YU has its own college and university, and the HTC of Chicago also incorporates a junior liberal arts college, was actually at that time working to partner with Northwestern and Loyola, which graduates continue at other colleges and graduate schools. There can be little doubt that the Old World type is not the kind of contemporary rabbinical school for which we are asking, and that is it. I'm not here to advocate, offers Dr. Berkowitz, for the Lakewood Yeshiva, for BMG, for Beis Medrash Kabbalah. That's not my vision. But one has no right to criticize them, deeply respectful of that tradition. They do not acknowledge that Jewish communities do live in the context of secular civilizations. They have a different strategy to Galut Judaism. But for us, he acknowledges what has then come into the fore, which is the so-called day school movement, or a spike in admission, and the numbers of schools between 1945 and 1965 are astronomical. But we need, offers Dr. Berkowitz, a modern yeshiva, one which subscribes, whether intuitively or because they read him, like we have today, that can somehow leverage the past and strike at the needs of the present. In the end, I think it's fair to say that Dr. Berkowitz understood that his role was not as a to transform Galut Judaism. He had dedicated the first 2/3 of his life to that initiative, but it was then to move to Eretz Israel, to move to Israel, to take advantage and to offer what he could intellectually and actively to the efforts in Israel. And he moves in 1975. He moves there over a period of time. He starts to release himself from obligations in Chicago, and he finally, by the mid-1970s, is living full-time in Israel. And he writes a long op-ed in the Jerusalem Post, again, a little studied as far as I know, called Like All the Nations. And here I just want to pull out a couple of sections. I want to leave some time for rebuttals or questions. Were we a people of the Galut, in spite of our dispersion and except for non-essential regional and communal variations, there existed a uniform way of life in all the lands of our exiles, very consistent about the strategies of living in the Galut. The crisis that besets us today, the fact that so many of our hopes and expectations did not materialize, is an indication that Zionism's blunder, its inability to recognize the uniqueness of Jewish peoplehood, here he's drawing from Ahad Ha'am and Kaplan to some extent, has served its purpose. And now, once again, whether we like it or not, the historic uniqueness of our people stares at us. The problem of Jewish homelessness, if home means security, has not been solved. The Jew in the state of Israel lives in greater danger to his mere physical survival than in most other places in the world, shortly after the Yom Kippur War. One might even say that just as the individual Jew was homeless in the Galut, so is the state of Israel homeless to a large extent in the world. Our enemies are succeeding in isolating us more and more, both militaristically, but also politically. We do not properly belong to any of the power constellations. In spite of all our efforts to be like all the other nations, we are not really considered one of the normal company. We have to withdraw from this dead-end street of our spiritual barrenness, from the identity vacuum into which we have maneuvered ourselves. We have to restore ourselves to our historic identity in all its uniqueness. We have to find a way back to the Judaism of the ages. He concludes this about the religious Zionists and the Chilonim anti-Zionists as well. Notwithstanding our respective shortcomings, we have to turn to each other in order to find ourselves, to discover that we are to become of what was, though not for the sake of what was. Let me stop share. So in some real sense, what Dr. Berkovitz does at the end of his life is understands that a strategy of Galut Judaism is just as applicable to Eretz Yisrael Judaism. The idea of Jewish peoplehood and of disparate people who might not necessarily understand what they are doing and operating in a particular ecosystem, particular environment. He applies the same anthropology, the same almost nonprofit strategy from 1942 in his Shavuot sermon on the brink of utter destruction of European Jewry. He understood quite well that now is a place for Eretz Yisrael Judaism. This idea of getting people together who have to agree on somehow leveraging the past, but also making sure that it sticks for the present moment. That's what he always aspired for. It's always what he worried for about American Jewry, technologically, politically, Zionistically. It's what he had hoped to achieve in his various operations as a public figure in Chicago and in Boston, and even as far as Baltimore, when he visited from time to time. It's what he strived for in his position at the Hebrew Theological College. And ultimately, it was his greatest hope to take that Galut Judaism and anthropology and somehow apply it to his final community, that being in Eretz Yisrael. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi Eller. I must say, you have revived my father for me.
Oh my goodness.
I feel as if I met him again. A lot of what you told us was known, but a lot of it was new even to me, and presumably would be to my brothers as well. And it was, now I know what Galut anthropology is, but I was really delighted to go through the history of my father's writings and preaching and teaching and fighting for a cause. I think it was marvelous. We do have a little time for questions if there are any. Michal, do you see anything?
Yes, there's one question. I'll send it to you.
Thank you.
Did you own a television?
Pardon?
When you were a child, did your mother and father own a television?
When I was a child? When I
Yes.
was a child, there was not such a thing as television. I was never a resident in Chicago.
No, oh, I didn't know. Okay.
Or hardly in Boston either. In Boston, they got their first TV set. And I must tell you, I don't know if you know Dov, my kid brother, that he was allowed half an hour per day on television. But he soon realized that all the cowboy half-hour shows were only important the five minutes before they ended. And so he would watch the last 5 minutes, turn it off, turn it on again. And that way he saw several shows every day. Smart kid. Still a smart kid. I don't know, there's a very odd question, which I can't, somebody's complaining that that Galut was misspelled.
No. So I think that was mine.
That's not the end of the
Let me be
world.
clear, I think that is, I was a victim of autocorrect. Yes. And when it appeared in the essay, it was G-A-L-U-T, not Galt. Yes.
All right, yes, but everybody knew that. He even knew that it was misspelled. Well, apparently everything you said was so clear and so interesting and so fascinating, I must say, that I can only say thank you very, very much.
I have to say thank you to you. This was an opportunity to think deeply about somebody on whose shoulders we stand.
Our friend Roy Pinchot is asking a question.
Oh no, he knows he's part of the history in a wonderful.
All part of the history.
Yes, he's part of
Yes,
the shul.
yes.
So I'll read it to you. Your talk made his heart break understandable, as he saw little amelioration of the Jewish problem in America or Israel, and how even modern Jewish education was failing to meet his expectation of preparing the new Jewish young man or woman for a revitalized Jewish future.
Then I have a question. Was your father, did he strike you as a pessimist? Some of his, by nature, the style of writing for public intellectuals was criticism. And especially in his Holocaust theology with Rubinstein and others, he was very critical. But there was disappointment, clearly he articulated. He tried desperately hard. But did he strike you as either an optimist, a realist, or a pessimist?
He was an optimist. He at one point said that if Israel fails, then God has left history. So if that's not optimism, I don't know what is.
It's not optimism.
However, like all great single thinkers, he felt very much alone. And that, to a certain extent, is depressing. And he fought that all his life. Probably less so in Chicago, because in Chicago, he found some kindred spirits and was able to do a great number of things which he wasn't able to achieve beforehand.
Like the Pinchots.
For example, and company. I don't have to tell you, you were there.
No, he wasn't there.
Well, I was part of the milieu that benefited from Dr. Berkowitz's work, and I can tell you that I was very proud to make sure that all of my students, I was the dean of the undergraduate program and the provost. I can tell you that if they left HTC and they did not know who Dr. Berkowitz was, it means they tried really, really hard to ignore me.
But I must tell you, here in the Mugam where we live, there are a few of his ex-students here, and they still remember him fondly.
And you saw that in the Kol Shabbat notice. They went out of their way that Dr. Berkowitz is a treasure, as not just as a scholar, but not every scholar is a good educator, and not every educator is a Baal Midot. Here was somebody who was able to ascertain so much in all three qualities. Yizichro Baruch, what can I say? One of the great champions of any cause that any of us on this call are a part of.
Well, now I'm beginning to tear, so I'm going to send you home. There's another comment here from Mary B. It doesn't say which B she is. Thank you for showing me a new and interesting angle of my dear grandfather. That is my daughter, Miriam.
I just report the news very late. I'm not a philosopher, I'm a historian. I just deal with the facts, but I'm glad to share. And of course, if anybody on this call, zlf@gratz.edu, if you want these slides, if you want any of these materials,
Absolutely, we want the slides.
I will send it post haste.
Oh, very sweet of you. Very nice of you.
Okay.
So thank you again.
My
And Ktiva v'chatima tova. We're almost there.
Almost there. All right, kol tuv, everybody. Bye-bye.
Kol tuv. Thank everybody, and thank you, Michal.
I don't get you. You have people in no favor.